Szanowni Państwo, witam serdecznie w imieniu Fundacji imienia
Ladies and
Janusza
gentlemen,
Kurtyki.
welcome so
Jest gościem
warmly on
okazji
behalf of
kontynuować projekt Nagroda
Janusz
Imienia
Kurtyka
Kurtyki,
Foundation. My name is Łukasz Płoski.
najważniejszy
It's my
projekt
honor to
Fundacji, w
continue the
którym
Kurtyka
staramy
Prize,
się
which
wybierać
is the
najlepsze prace
key project of a
polityczne
foundation. We're trying to
na
select
języki obce,
the best
wydawać
works
przez
of Polish
fundację z
historians, translate
międzynarodowymi
them into
wydawcami, a
foreign
następnie w
languages,
ramach spotkań
and
takich jak to
then publish them
promować te
with
książki i
international
opowiadać o
publishers.
nich
And
z
during
naszymi
meetings like
partnerami
this one, we
zagranicznymi.
promote these books and discuss them with our foreign
Jestem ogromnie
partners.
zaszczycony, że
It is a
podczas
great
dzisiejszego
honor for
spotkania
me
możemy współpracować
that
z
to
naszym partnerem,
during
z
this
Instytutem
meeting
Jana
we
Pawła
can work
II
with
oraz
our
z
partner, the
Uniwersytetem
Institute of
St.
John
Thomasza w
Paul
Houston.
II
W
at the
związku z tym chciałbym
University
bardzo
of St.
serdecznie
Thomas in
powitać pana
Houston. May
Johna
I, for
Corrigana
that
oraz
reason,
również pana
welcome
profesora Johna
Dr.
Hittingera.
John Corrigan.
Witam
I can
panów i
also see
bardzo serdecznie
Professor
dziękuję za to,
John
że po raz
Hittinger.
kolejny
Thank you very much,
współpracujemy.
gentlemen, for
Dr
cooperating
Corrigan
with
będzie
us again.
podczas dzisiejszego
Dr.
spotkania
Corrigan, during this meeting,
prezentował dla Państwa
will
krótkie
present
wprowadzenie
for you
dotyczące
a
tego, w
brief
jaki sposób
introduction
rolę
on how the
Polski w
roles
regionie
of
Europy
Poland
Środkowo-Wschodniej
in the
widział
Central and Eastern
Jan Paweł
European
II.
region was seen
Wprowadzenie
by
to
John Paul II.
będzie
That
pewnym
introduction
tłem
will
do
be
rozważań
a
na temat tego
particular
samego regionu,
background
ale
for considerations
dokładniej roli,
of the region,
dokładniej tego, jak w
precisely
swojej polityce pamięci, w
how
polityce historycznej
in the
widzi
political
Rosję.
history and
I drodzy Państwo, pozwólcie,
history of
że
memory is seen by
krótko przedstawię
Russia.
właśnie pana
Ladies
doktora
and gentlemen,
Corrigana,
please let me
który
give
jest
a
filozofem, jest dyrektorem
short
Instytutu
view
Jana Pawła II
on our
i
guest. Dr.
specjalistą
Corrigan is
właśnie
a professor of John
zajmującym
Paul
się
II
historią
University and expert in
naszego
the
świętego
thoughts of
papieża.
our
Doktor Corrigan
Saint
posiada
Pope.
silne związki
Dr.
z
Corrigan
Polską.
has strong
Bywa w naszym kraju, także
ties to
cały
Poland.
Instytut
He has
ściśle
visited
współpracuje z polskimi
Poland, and
instytucjami.
the whole
Jesteśmy zaszczyceni,
institute
że
works very
możemy być
closely with
jedną,
Polish institutions. It's a
jedną z nich.
great honor for us to
Szanowni
be
Państwo,
one
dzisiejsze
of those
spotkanie
institutions.
związane jest
This
z książką pana
meeting
profesora
is
Macieja
connected
Materskiego, który
to
czyta
the
dzisiaj główny
book of
wykład.
Professor
Jest to
Materski.
książka Od Tsara
He will
do
have
Czara, przegląd
the
rosyjskiej polityki
keynote
historycznej.
speech today.
Książka ta zdobyła
That's the
nagrodę
book
imienia
from
Kurtyki,
the
7
Russian
edycję
Tsar
tej
to
nagrody
Tsar.
i jako
It
taka została,
won the Kurtyka
została
Prize in
wzmocniona o
the
angielski i
seventh
niemiecki. Jest w
edition
procesie
of this
wydawniczym.
prize.
Ujrzy
It was
światło
translated as
dzienne
such into German and
nakładem
English
wydawnictwa
and is
De
being now
Chodzi o
published. It
książkę w
will
wersji
be
anglojęzycznej
published
oraz
by De
Peter
Gruyter,
Lang, jeśli
the
chodzi
English
o
version, and
publikację w
Peter
wersji
Lang, that's the
niemiecko-angielskiej.
German
Tak
version
jak
language.
wspominałem,
As I have
drodzy
mentioned,
Państwo, nasze
ladies and
spotkanie
gentlemen, our
rozpocznie wstęp,
translation
który
will start
wygłosi pan profesor
from
John
an
Corrigan
introduction
i
by
proponuję przejście do
Dr.
tego
Corrigan,
momentu.
and I
Panie profesorze,
suggest
jeszcze raz
we,
bardzo dziękuję za
without further ado,
nawiązanie współpracy i
pass to
oddaję
that.
panu
Thank
głos.
you very much, Doctor, for starting this cooperation, and now the floor goes to you.
Thank you. It is my great honor to welcome you here tonight for what promises to be an enlightening and thought-provoking discussion with Dr. Wojciech Materski, a historian of remarkable insight and rigor. He will be speaking on his book, From the Tsars to the Tsar, a work that delves into the intricate and often turbulent history of Russian political power from its imperial roots to the present day. I am Dr. John Corrigan of the St. John Paul II Institute, and I'm happy to see that our founder, Dr. Hittinger, was in fact able to join us. We are located at the University of St. Thomas, Houston, in Texas. We offer a fully online master's degree or a certificate in the thought of John Paul II, following the themes of his 14 encyclicals and many additional expert authors around those themes and encyclicals. We are very happy to be partnering today with our friends at the Kurtyki Foundation. What makes Materski's work so compelling is his ability to explore the deeper philosophical and cultural currents that have shaped Russian history and continue to influence its trajectory. As we consider this historical panorama, it invites us to reflect on broader themes of power, authority, and the human spirit's resilience under varying forms of governance. In doing so, his book connects beautifully with the thought of St. John Paul II, a man deeply attuned to the interplay of history, culture, and the dignity of the human person. John Paul II often spoke about the profound impact that ideas, systems of power, and national histories have on the moral and spiritual development of societies. His reflections on freedom, responsibility, and the importance of preserving human dignity resonate profoundly with the historical narrative that Matursky is presenting. Without revealing key insights of his book, I want to suggest that his analysis invites us to consider not just the arc of Russian history, but also how the lessons of that history may speak to our own time. In the spirit of John Paul II, we are called to view history not merely as a record of events, but as a teacher of truths, truths about the human person, about society, and about the enduring struggle for authentic freedom. As you listen to Dr. Matursky, I encourage you to consider the following points of overlap of these two thinkers. Number one, Poland as the bulwark of European identity. Matursky emphasizes the historical role of Poland as a cultural and geopolitical barrier against Russian expansionism, and as a defender of Western traditions in East Central Europe. For example, the partitions of Poland 1772-1795 and subsequent suppression of Polish identity by Russia highlights Poland's struggle to maintain its Western identity. Similarly, John Paul II frequently referred to Poland as the guardian of Europe's Christian soul, emphasizing Poland's historical mission to preserve its Catholic and European identity in the face of external pressures, particularly from the East. This is seen, for example, in his address in Gniezno during his first papal pilgrimage, where he framed Poland as central to the cultural and spiritual unity of Europe, as witnessed in his book, Memory and Identity, which he recalls that speech. The second point is the politics of memory in shaping national identity. Matursky argues that Russia's manipulation of history aims to consolidate national identity and justify political actions. Poland often features as a symbol of resistance to Russian imperialism. For example, the Katyn massacre and how it was suppressed, while John Paul II advocated for the remembrance of historical truth as the foundation for reconciliation and national dignity. He would view the remembrance of events like Katyn as essential for healing and justice. In his 1990 call for Russia to acknowledge the truth about atrocities, for example, which he references in his work, Rise, Let Us Be on Our Way. The third is Poland as a bridge between East and West. Matursky highlights Poland's role as a mediator between Western Europe and Russia due to its geographical and cultural position, often caught between two competing spheres of influence. For example, Poland's role in NATO and the EU as a counterbalance to Russian influence in the post-Soviet states. And John Paul II reiterated Poland's vocation to build bridges between East and West. He saw Poland's Christian heritage as key to fostering dialogue and peace in a divided Europe. Some examples of that are his efforts to engage Eastern Orthodox leaders and promote dialogue with Russia, as well as his papal work, Slavorum Apostoli. The fourth point of consideration, the role of Catholicism in shaping regional politics. Matursky examines how Russia used Orthodox Christianity as a tool of imperial and political influence, contrasting it with Poland's strong Catholic identity. For example, Poland's Catholic Church is a center of resistance during communist rule. While John Paul II emphasized the Church's role as a defender of Polish identity and freedom, particularly during Soviet domination, his fight for the church at Nowa Huta is a great example, and he linked Catholic social teaching with Poland's independence movement. He also was supportive of the Solidarity movement, and his homilies both in 1979 and 1983 show this during his pilgrimages to Poland. The fifth is Poland as the struggle for sovereignty. Materski details Russia's historical attempts to suppress Polish sovereignty and autonomy, framing Poland as a symbol of resistance in Eastern Europe. An example is Poland's fight for independence post-World War I and during the Cold War. While John Paul II saw Poland's struggle for sovereignty as emblematic of human dignity and freedom, his advocacy for Poland's liberation from Soviet influence was deeply rooted in the principle of human rights and the gospel. Again, this is seen in his address to the United Nations in 1979 and reiterated in Witness to Hope by George Weigel. And the sixth point is the role of memory in regional reconciliation. Materski advocates for addressing historical wounds, such as the Katyn massacre and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as prerequisites for true reconciliation between Poland and Russia. John Paul II promoted forgiveness, but not with forgetting. He encouraged remembering these things. He saw truth and memory as essential for reconciliation between the nations. And this is seen in his 1997 message to the Polish-Russian Reconciliation Committee. There are many other points, but I think these points will have to suffice. They demonstrate how Materski's analysis of memory, politics, and historical narratives intersects with John Paul II's theological and philosophical reflections on Poland's identity and mission. Both emphasize Poland's enduring significance as a cultural, spiritual, and geopolitical actor. Please reflect on how the historical journey Materski describes mirrors the challenges John Paul II often addressed: the tensions between power and service, ideology and truth, oppression and liberation. So without further ado, despite my mispronunciations and anything I may have mischaracterized, which I'm sure our speaker can correct, I'd like to welcome Dr. Wojciech Materski and turn things over to him.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie doktorze. Witam państwa. Czuję się zaszczycony,
Thank
że
you very
mogę
much,
kilka
Doctor.
tez o
Let me
rozwoju
welcome you.
zwyczajów
It's an
wyborczych
honor
wśród
to
Polski
be sharing
zareklamować
those
tak prestiżowych
subjects
rozwiązań
on
Użyte
Central and
w
Eastern
tytule
Europe for such a
niniejszego referatu
prestigious
określenie polityka historyczna
center
nie
of
doczekało
academic
się ściślej
education.
definicji.
There is
W
no
mediach społecznych
strict
traktowany
definition
jest jako
of
narzędzie,
this
którym posługują
historical
się
truth.
podmioty
It's a
polityczne
tool
w
used
celu
by
kształtowania
political
pożądanej
bodies
wizji przeszłości
to
państwa i
shape
narodu.
their
Pożądanej,
preferred
a więc
preferred
zmanipulowanej.
vision of a
Wizja
state
ta
and
to wynik
nation.
łączenia
Preferred
z
means
sobą w jedną narrację
manipulated.
wybranych epizodów z historii,
That's connecting
tworzenie specjalnej
various
opowieści
episodes from
sytuującej
history
właściwe
and
wydarzenia i
building a
właściwe
special
osoby, narzucającej
tale that
określoną
lays an
interpretację
emphasis
dominującą.
on proper people and
Celem tak uprawionej polityki
vision.
historycznej jest przede
The
wszystkim
goal
osiągnięcie
of
doraźnej
such
korzyści,
a policy is
wsparcia politycznego,
attaining
umożliwienia szerokim
political
elektoracie dla swoich
support
działań,
and
wytworzenia na tle
also creation
bezalternatywnie przedstawionej
of
historii wysokiego stopnia
history
integracji społecznej,
that allows
a
social
zarazem
integration,
umocnienia
although it's not
prestiżu swego
true,
państwa
and
na zewnątrz, w
reinforcement
przestrzeni
of the
międzynarodowej.
prestige of its state outside,
Polityka ta
internationally.
sprawdza się
That
najlepiej w systemach
policy
totalitarnych,
passes
w
the
których
test best
zharmonizowanie
in
obecnych
totalitarian
dogmatycznym
systems
i publicystycznym
where
treści założonym przez narzucające
building
je
together a new
wprowadzi
message
stwarzać
from
takich
various
proporcjach
elements
społeczeństwa
won't
demokratycznych.
cause the problems that may be faced by
Polityka historyczna
democratic
państwa nie jest
states.
więc sposobem
Historical
uprawiania
policy of a
historii,
state then
lecz
is
narzędziem
not a
w
way
ręku
of
jego władz.
practicing history, but
Poprzez
it's a
mniej czy
tool
bardziej
in the hands of the
zmanipulowany
state's
sposób przedstawiania
authorities.
procesu dziejowego służy
Through
legitymizacji państwa. Przeprowadza
his
jako historycznie
manipulated
uzasadnione go prawo do
historical process,
niezależnego
more or
funkcjonowania.
less, it serves to legitimize
Zarazem
the
kształtuje
state,
pożądane
portrays
przez
its
władze
right to
wzorce swojej
independent
tożsamości
existence
narodowej,
as
ku tym
historically
identyfikacji
justified.
postaw
Also
społecznych,
shapes the identity model
wzmacnia
that the
świąteczne
authorities
narzucające swoje
desire,
poglądy,
types of
doktryny
social
polityczne,
identification and
interpretacje, a
attitudes,
nawet światopogląd.
reinforces
Innymi
specific
słowy,
views, political
wymucza,
doctrines,
by historia jako
interpretations, and
nauka,
even
działacz
worldview.
edukacji czy też
In other
dziedzina
words, it
publicystyki
forces history as a
obsługiwała
science,
naukę
branch of
legitymujący
education,
państwa.
to serve the interests of the state, not the public discourse. By employing historical policy, the state resolves disputes surrounding history and holds a monopoly on establishing truth. The state's control over the past, achieved by regulation of knowledge and accompanying commentaries, is also a form of political control, the more effective in states where the society is weak.
So, I will assume that this is the policy of the state, which does not exist. There are many organizations that actually pursue that. It is the state that has the financial and other resources to actually make this work. It is the state that approves curricula, textbooks that contain the proper or appropriate vision of history and oversees their implementation. It co-finances various forms of academic research to a large degree, as well as commemorative events for various historical events. And we're talking about such events as things organized by museums, memorials, and it's the state that inspires specific directions for research and how it's popularized. And it depends on the priorities that has been, or rather they have been adopted by the current internal needs. It's the state that enforces certain things through financial mechanisms, political pressure, even repression. Now, the content of the politics of memory basically are linked to international position of the state and also its domestic policies. And the weaknesses can divert attention by using appropriately crafted historical arguments, by stirring up nationalist sentiments. Now, the Russian politics of memory is divided to distinct periods, Tsarist, Soviet, and Russian, but exhibits a number of common features. The territory is comparable. Also, there is this European-Asian civilizational divide, and also this centralized vertical model of unchecked executive power. Another common thing is the facade nature of democratic institutions, a system of societal control. The society is disciplined and poorly educated. And there is this mechanism of mythologizing the past. Also, there are these tendencies to suppress anything that is critical of government-imposed historical narratives. And there is this also great Russian megalomania. In Russia, history has been treated as a political tool. And basically, there is this myth of the anointed ruler, or during the Soviet period, there was this myth of a leading role of the social class, of a certain social class, that is the proletariat. And there are these myths. There is this cult of the leader. Well, it could be a Tsar or a dynasty or a general secretary or a president. And it is there, as well as on religious grounds, that certain attitudes were shaped and their own crimes and errors were relativized. Ever since the Tsarist times until the present day, the center of power has attached a lot of importance to the political possibilities that are inherent in skillful manipulation, in historical propaganda, which is basically the primary tool of politics of memory. And the content was closely linked to the state external actions, which have been consistently aggressive, at least since Ivan III the Great. We could say today that they were imperialistic in nature. The politics of memory would preemptively indicate and justify the direction of expansion and then glorify its course and its outcome, minimize the number of victims and maximize the perceived benefits that have been achieved. Relatively early on, the Western direction appeared in this Russian politics of memory. Ivan III was probably the first one to lay claims in this regard, and he justified his rights to lands between the Upper Vistula and Upper Neman to this. And he claimed, or rather, let me rephrase that. So today, it sounds like an anecdote, but in the 16th century, the whole story of Rurik was taken very seriously because it was a potential cause for war with Russia. So there was this threat of Russian expansion westward, and it turned actually real under the reign of Peter the Great, because then Russia officially was declared an empire. The goal was to secure ice-free ports on the Baltic and Black Seas. With time, Russia got involved in the Great Northern War, and the Central European element started to appear in Russian politics of memory, but it was marginal at that time. Now, the peak of the Russian imperial politics was the reign of Catherine II, and this is when Russia basically became the largest colonial power. There were intrigues and conquests and annexations. It is in this way that Catherine expanded the state and its population from 20 to over 35 million. Most of this growth came from the territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The partitions took place because of her. Catherine created a prison for dozens of nations, including Belarusians and Lithuanians, Moldavians, Poles, Ruthenians, and Ukrainians. So basically, these actions were presented as a civilizing mission, and the Russian politics of memory focused on just that, to justify all that. So there was this political motivation, but there was also this confessional aspect of that policy. You can see it quite clearly in mid-19th century. The Orthodoxy was proclaimed as the only true religion. Allegedly, after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the Russian Church was supposed to be the sole legitimate heir and defender of this empire. There was this unity of Slavs, as they called it. It was proposed in Russian politics of memory. It was supposed to be basically realized on the foundation of Orthodoxy. The ultimate goal of this policy was to save Europe, because only the true faith, that is, Orthodoxy, could prevent Europe's continued descent into the swamp created by the French Revolution. Now, the main problem was in Roman Catholic Poland, which was basically described as the agent of Vatican and therefore a traitor to the Slavic cause. And the consequences were various repressive measures against the church in Polish lands. Under Russian partition, monasteries were dissolved, so were religious orders, there were mass deportations to Siberia. Also, the Tsars claimed that they had this the right to the patronage there. But then came Napoleon and its defeat. There was the Congress of Vienna, and there was this alliance. The Holy Alliance was set up. It was supposed to maintain the balance of power in Europe. In effect, it was supposed to legitimize Russia's right to oversee, control the region. This mechanism was called the Concert of Europe. Later was used as the foundation for memory politics among the great powers up to and including World War II, and basically led to the creation of a certain system. We had the United Nations, and the permanent members of the Security Council were basically an equivalent of the Holy Alliance. So, if you look at that, you will see the Central and Eastern Europe region. It was assumed to be explicitly or implicitly controlled by Russia and later by the Soviet Union. In this post-Soviet or rather post-war period, the dominant argument was that the Soviet Union had a right to decide the region's future due to the sacrifices made by the Red Army. There were a number of arguments. The Red Army and the Soviet Union was supposed to have acted altruistically, and the claim was made that the Soviet Union was the biggest power of this anti-Nazi coalition. And it's the Soviet Union was claimed that should be the guarantor of those countries' future. And after World War II, a special zone was set up that was controlled by the Soviet Union. It was basically a part of this memory of policy of politics, or rather the politics of memory. And then it was claimed that a unity was needed to push back against the Germans, and what was stressed in this politics of memory was the Battle of Grunwald, 1410, one of the largest battles in medieval Europe. In various popular texts and ceremonial speeches, statements made by politicians, it was stressed that this victory is possible only thanks to Slavic unity, because there were these combined forces, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Ruthenian forces, Czech troops too. Also, mythological arguments were used. There is this myth of three brothers, Lech, Czech, and Rus, which were those mythical progenitors of Poland, Czech, and Russia. But there is another legend what spoke of other brothers, Kiev, Szczek, and Koryv, and this version was supposed to justify those alleged ties between Rus and Southern Slavs, including Bulgaria and the later nations of the Yugoslav Federation. Basically, it was a reference to this 19th century Slavophilism of Tsarist Russia, which opposed Russia and Central Europe to this allegedly degenerate Western civilization. Now, these legends were supposed to build a kind of foundation for the effective Sovietization of the Central and Eastern Europe. There was the Slavic movement, which was coordinated by the Moscow-based Pan-Slavic Committee. There were 5 national Slavic committees within the Yalta Zone countries, and there was the Slavic Congress in the United States too. The influence could be seen also in the UN. There was this bloc of states that worked closely with the Soviet Union, and it was referred as the group of Slavic countries. It included Albania and Romania and Hungary. After the Paris Peace Treaties in 1947 had to be somehow integrated into the rest of the Yalta Zone. And that led to this creation of bilateral friendship societies with Soviet unions. It promoted the idea of socialist internationalism and gradually replaced the myth of Slavic unity. But there were also other propaganda and educational systems in these Yalta Zone states. What mattered to them was to treat the Soviet Union as the only driving force behind the victory in World War II. And thus, communist parties basically had some kind of legitimacy, the mandate to seize power. And that justified new forms of statehood that was modeled on this victorious Soviet system. So this was propaganda, and under this propaganda, this image of victorious coalition quickly faded. It was blurred. And there was this image of the Red Army, which was basically the force that single-handedly saved the world from fascism. And then there were other institutions that coordinated the whole process in various fields. There was this historical research themes, there were methodologies. And there were certain associations of Marxist historians that played a role. There were informal police forces that supervised the methods of research. At universities, you had the Soviet history departments that were established. And the world history was taught based on this class interpretation, it was very crudely understood. Also, there would be these monuments and memorials that were erected in various places that had been traversed by the Red Army. Now, in 1956, there was this Congress of the Communist Party, and this is when certain changes started occurring in this politics of memory. There was this thesis that there are different paths to systemic change and to how to introduce socialism. So you had this approach taken by the Yugoslav communist and also this other path, the right-wing nationalist deviation, as it was called in Poland, and they were all included in the framework. There was this mythology of the Red Army's liberating mission, so that state, it remained intact. And now, there was this
The efficient
thesis
Yalta
that basically the theory confronted practice at a certain point because there was the Prague, the spring of the Prague. This is when the propagandists in the Kremlin had to change their own approach, and they said that certain sovereignty issues had to be limited.
was to result from its historically justified special truths to the region, and that was identified with the so-called Yalta Zone. The commenters immediately called it the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was made part of scientific nomenclature as well. During the operation of so-called Yalta Zone in Europe, the governments subservient to Moscow followed a specific historical policy. With the aid of Russian historical policy presented as own, efforts were made to reinforce the historical legitimization of their power. They were imposed to the society through names of squares, streets, and also monuments. They received special commentaries in school books, encyclopedias, and mass media. They were considered a powerful authority in spreading power, persuading the society that the society has to found their statehood on a close alliance with the Soviet Union, in some cases to the extent of enshrining it in the constitution. A certain attempt to change the narrative in Russian historical policy came with President Boris Yeltsin. However, it almost exclusively focused on revaluation of internal matters. Yeltsin's efforts to delegitimize Bolshevism and recognize it a criminal regime from its earliest days, as we know, ended in failure. However, the issues of the Central European region remained a marginal aspect of any such re-evaluation, although certain elements of it can be noted. For example, analyzing the positions and statements of Russian officials during bilateral meetings, whether in Warsaw or in Baltic capitals. This probably stemmed from Yeltsin's limited interest in the ideology of the so-called Ruski Mir, a foreign policy doctrine aimed at creating a supranational network of contacts to establish Russia as a global civilization center, imposing its rules and methods on the entire world. However, the Ruski Mir ideology was executed by his successor, Vladimir Putin, who rose to power in 2000. During over 20 years of his rule, the central and overwhelmingly dominant theme of Russian historical policy was taken by the Second World War, based on selectively treated events from its second phase, so-called Great Patriotic War of 1941-45. The myth of the heroic Soviet Union, the great victor, a superpower that secured peace for the world, was continuously expanded. The Russian Federation, current Russian Federation being its successor, claims that the rights stemming from Red Army's liberation of Central and Eastern Europe now have an unpayable debt of gratitude. This narrative disregards controversies surrounding the costs that those nations borne during this liberation and subsequent decades of Soviet supervision. To conclude, we can argue that the Russian historical policy towards Central and Eastern Europe, at least since the Congress of Vienna of 1815, hasn't changed. It treats the region not only as its sphere of influence, but also of domination, with the right of annexation included. That claim is justified by selectively treated historical arguments, which both St. Petersburg and later Moscow used to support their openly aggressive actions. These arguments justify not only the rights to dictate the fate of Central and Eastern Europe, but even to influence the Middle East, portraying Russia as a successor to Byzantium's civilizational and religious mission. Changing governments adjusted no more than methods, but the use of fabricated historical arguments remains constant. Moreover, the diplomatic methods were generally subordinated to forceful measures, open aggression, and the threat of force. Today, we're in such a phase. Open aggression in Ukraine, fears of escalation to other countries, including threats of nuclear weapons. The world must treat these threats very seriously. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Professor, very much for this interesting lecture. May I also thank Dr. Corrigan for introduction, because I haven't had an opportunity, but that was a very interesting combination of those two threads of John Paul II with the reflection of Professor Materski. Now it's the time for the Q&A session. Everyone is invited to take the floor and to ask Professor Materski. You can do it by the raise your hand icon, then I will know that you want to take the floor, and I will try to make it sure for you to take the floor. I can see that there's Dr. Corrigan who wants to speak, so I'm just now over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Matersky. That was very, very interesting and a great refresher memory of so many things that are important in Poland and the history of Eastern and Western Europe. Something came to mind that I wonder if you might be able to comment on. I really am interested in your idea of politics of memory. I'd actually never heard that before looking at your works. It's an interesting idea, and I think it's very important. Poland's image and their memory, as you suggest, was somewhat overshadowed by Soviet propaganda for a long time. The election of John Paul helped bring a little relief to that. At least one Polish man was able to project a more Polish view of Poland. But he has been gone now for quite some time. I was wondering, how do you feel Poland today is doing as far as projecting its own memory, its own image, and what could be done to improve that?
Nie wiem, czy mam awista odpowiadać?
I don't know. Am I supposed to answer immediately? Yes, please, Professor. Yes. If you're ready, yes, please. Thank you very much, Doctor, for that question. Politics of memory may be less used in Poland or in several other states, but is very much alive in Austria and is very often used there and in Germany as well. That's a narrowing down of historical memory. It's narrowing it down to the quantum of knowledge that the society should remember and that it is being reminded, as I mentioned, by films, TV programs, naming conventions. Now, do we cope? I'm sorry, I'm going to answer like this, but I caught a bad cold, and please excuse me. Well, do we manage to cope with our history and memory policy? It's first of all confronted with Russia, with Russian policy. We hardly stand any chance of breaking through with our narrative. The Polish language is an exotic language. There are few people in the world who communicate in Polish. Of course, in the US, for example, in Chicago, there are plenty of such people. Nevertheless, compared to the amount of information given people in Russian and observed in all the academic institutions, well, our capacity here is modest. But efforts must be taken, must be made. That's why I believe it's so important to emphasize what Kurtyka Foundation does. It tries to take those books of Polish historians, do not mistake them for historical policy. These are those that present the Polish point of view, and the foundation makes sure that they find their way to the English-speaking realm or the German-speaking realm. In the confrontation imposed by Russia, our options are more than limited. Thank you very much, Professor, for your answer. Now we have a question from Witold. Yes, please, you can. We have Witold Łukaszewski speaking.
Professor Łukaszewski, your mute is on. Unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. In the Russian writings, as I remember, there is some ambivalence in terms of treating the history as a weapon or an instrument of politics. Alexander Prokhanov, for example, wrote at one time that, and I quote, "Dla mnie imperium to nie kolonie I metropolie."
For me, empire is no colonies and metropolis, but a symphony of nations and spaces. It's important whether today's Russia will manage to retain that symphony, if not even spread it over those territories that we have lost after 1991. On the other hand, Yerofeyev says it straight away. We are a nation. He speaks of Russians. We are a nation that shapes its historical memory as a fairy tale. And that's a quote. So we have here, we're dealing here with two versions of those
tego podejścia do historii
of that approach to
rosyjskiej.
history of Russia.
A z drugiej strony,
On the other hand,
mnie się wydaje, że
I personally
że
believe that
problem Polski jest w pewnej
the problem of
części
Poland is,
tym, że jesteśmy
to an
narodem,
extent, it lies
państwem
in the fact that
między
we are
dwoma
a
potęgami,
state, a nation
których
living
interesem
between two powers,
są
whose
zdławienie
interests
polskiej narracji, która się przejawia
include
moim
the
zdaniem
smothering of the Polish
właściwie
narrative, which I believe is present in the narrative that consolidates
pomaga
and
suwerenność,
supports
niezawisłość,
the
niepodległość.
sovereignty,
Mamy
the
z jednej
independence.
strony,
On the one hand,
niemiecka,
here we
z drugiej
have
strony
German
rosyjska,
narrative and the Russian
a
narrative
między
on the
nimi
other hand,
dwoma,
and between the two,
mniejsza, słabsza,
there is a smaller
ale
and
walcząca o
weaker,
niepodległość.
but fighting
Ta
for
Polska
sovereignty,
i te
the Polish
narracje
one.
historyczne są
And those
funkcjami
historical narratives
tych trzech
are the functions
podejść
of those three
do
approaches to
do polityki historycznej
history, to
w tych trzech krajach.
political history in those three countries.
Mogę się ustosunkować?
Bardzo proszę.
If I may,
Tak, proszę bardzo.
very much so. Yes, please.
Ja się z tym wszystkim, co pan doktor mówił, zgadzał. To tak
I agree
rzeczywiście jest.
with
Z
all
tym,
that
że
you've said,
wydawało
Doctor.
się, że XXI
It's very much the
wiek
case.
to już teraz
The thing
te
is,
podziały,
there was this impression
które
that
mówią o
in
kontroli nad
in the
terytorium,
21st
są anachroniczne.
century, these
Że
divisions,
już
the issue of
jesteśmy
controlling
jakby na
territory, that
innym
it's
etapie
all
rozwoju.
anachronistic, that we
Niemniej
are at a
to
different
rzeczywiście tak
stage of
jest.
development.
Natomiast ta narracja bajkowa, no,
This fairy
nie
tale
jest
or
narracja
fable
bajkowa,
narrative.
jeśli chodzi
Yes,
o mity,
you're right, because you've got these myths,
o historię o Lechu, Czechu i Rusie i tak
because you've
dalej.
got this myth of
Ale
those
trudno
three
za
brothers, Lech,
narrację
Czech.
bajkową przyjąć to, co powiedział Władimir Putin.
But then
i
you
co
have
trzeba
what
poważnie
Vladimir
wziąć pod
Putin
uwagę i jego
has said.
otoczenie, i
It
usłyszeć
was very
historyczne
seriously
fakty.
taken by his
Mianowicie,
milieu.
że największą tragedią XX
Namely,
wieku
he said that the
było
biggest
rozpad
tragedy
Związku
in the
Sowieckiego.
20th century
Nie
was the collapse of the
Holokaust,
Soviet
nie
Union,
wojny
not
światowe,
the Holocaust,
tylko
not
rozpad
the
Związku
World Wars,
Sowieckiego.
but the
To
collapse
jest
of the
rosyjska
Soviet
narracja.
Union. And this is
Natomiast,
the Russian
natomiast
narrative.
to ona różnie była definiowana i różnie była realizowana.
It's been
Oczywiście
defined
właściwie
and
polityce historycznej to
pursued
można mówić
historically
od
differently.
Wcześniej to
Karanzin is where you could start your story about this politics of
Natomiast w
memory.
okresie Mikołaja I dowinowała taka teza, którą
Under
przytoczyłem w książce w oryginale, że
Nikolai the
historia
First,
Rosji jest wspaniała.
there was this idea that the history of
Dzisiejszy
Russia
Rosji
is
jest
great
fantastyczny,
and that
a przyszłość
the
Rosji
current
przewyższa
day
wszelkie wyobrażenia.
in Russia is absolutely fantastic and the future,
To jest
the
bajkowa wykładnia,
tomorrow
to jest
is
prymitywna
going to be
wykładnia,
overwhelmingly
to jest
fantastic.
wykładnia taka
Is it a
policyjna.
fairy tale or maybe is it more the interpretation that could be described as that used by the police? Well, take your pick. The Republic of Poland is located where it is. Under, well, in the 16th century, Poland was a power. We could not keep that status, and basically we had no choice but to clash with certain other countries. Then there was this threat. It came to be in September 1931. Poland as a country was effectively destroyed. It is what it is.
Dziękuję, panie profesorze, za odpowiedź.
Professor, thank you
Państwa,
for
czy ktoś
your
jeszcze z państwa
answer.
chciałby zadać pytanie?
Ladies and gentlemen, are there any more questions? Because if so, you can simply raise your hand. Dr. Carrigan, I believe.
Dr. Corrigan chyba trzyma, cały czas ma tą ikonę
I
podniesioną.
believe that he still has his hand up, but Dr. Kissinger also would like to take the floor, I see.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor. I have a question with two sides to it. It's about religion, Catholicism, and this question of Polish identity vis-a-vis Russia. And First of all, I wonder if you could briefly say something about the facts on the ground that give lie to the symphony narrative, namely that Russia still has interfered with the various religious rites, Ruthenian, Ukrainian, Roman Catholic. And the claims, of course, of the Roman Church go way back to their expropriation of churches and so on. So that's surely a factor. But secondly, in a way even more important, my question is, do you think the Polish people continue to appreciate how central their identity lies in Roman Catholicism, not in its piety? I mean, obviously it's piety, but that in its cultural, historical role, Poland without Roman Catholicism would just not be able to stand and maintain a narrative against the encroachments from both sides, let's say. And now, of course, with Germany representing the EU, it's this secularizing that seems to have some inroads in Poland. So what's going to happen with Polish identity and its Catholicism in your estimation from a historical point of view?
Dziękuję za to pytanie i za ten niepokój.
Very much for this question and for the concern that you have just voiced, because it is also mine. Indeed, there is the stereotype, a Pole being a Roman Catholic. It's not just a stereotype, though. It's an actual fact. Because you had Catholicism, you had state structures, and this is how the state functioned in its confrontation, mostly but not exclusively, with Russia. The issue of religion, of confession, was very important indeed. There were, however, certain periods where it was quite dramatic. I mean, mostly 1830s, where churches, Catholic churches, were basically dissolved en masse, and priests would be sent to Siberia. Another period, World War II, it was then when many priests would be repressed, would be subjected to repressions. They would be sent to Auschwitz, because the occupier appreciated the importance of the Catholic Church in the maintenance of the Polish identity. After all, the Polish identity largely relies on faith. What we see today, it's a bit concerning, because not only in Western Europe, but also in Poland, we have seen this trend, maybe not so much a tendency to move away from the church, but rather not to be active. They choose not to be active. Maybe it's a bit of a generalization on my part. People believe that baptism is very important, the Holy Communion is important, but then you can simply give up on church and not be involved. Unfortunately, this process has been continuing, and if it continues, the traditional Polish identity, historically understood and regionally understood, will be very much weakened. Thank you.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze, za tę
Professor,
odpowiedź.
thank you for your answer.
Rękę ma doktora Piotra Przybylskiego.
Piotr Przybylski has raised his hand, I can see.
Proszę bardzo, prosimy o zadanie pytania.
Please ask your question.
Tak, dzień dobry panu.
Thank you.
Panie profesorze.
Good evening.
Dziękuję bardzo za ten,
Professor,
dobry wykład.
thank you for this very good
zadać
lecture.
dwa krótkie pytania.
I've got two
Właściwie
brief
one
questions.
dotyczą teraźniejszości i
They
przyszłości.
are concerned
Co
with
pan
the
profesor
present and with the
sądzi,
future. Professor,
no właśnie o tej niebezpiecznej idei
what do you
ruski
think
mir,
about this
czyli
dangerous
rosyjski świat,
idea,
propagowana
Ruski
przez
Mir,
Putina?
the
Czy
Russian world,
jeżeli Putin
which
się
is promoted
ośmieli,
by
to
Putin?
zaatakuje kraje NATO,
Putin
takie jak
might
Polska,
dare
Łotwa
to
i Estonia?
attack
Czy to jest
NATO
możliwe,
countries,
jeżeli,
Poland and the Baltic states such as
jeżeli
Latvia and
uda mu
Estonia?
się,
Is it possible?
jakby przynajmniej częściowo zwyciężyć z Ukrainą?
Well, he might do that if he defeats Ukraine, at least to some extent. The second question is, what do you think about the politics of memory as conducted by Mr. Nawrocki, who is running for presidency right now? I had the Polish studies at the University of St. Thomas. Thank you. So this Ruski Mir ideology, it's an ideology which has basically replaced communism. Communism and Komintern were supposed to be the tools that would allow for the control of the whole world. And now it's been rejected, it's gone. What stepped in its place is the so-called Ruski Mir concept, the Russian world, or the Russian order. It is an idea, a concept that is used as a way to reintegrate the so-called old Russian lands, as Putin calls it. So basically, we're talking about a territory where, in whichever point in time, the Russian army has once stood. This ideology is basically dangerous. It is something that the Russians understand, because basically it meets their emotional needs, their complexes, because they hear that Russia is what is healthy, globally speaking. They are being told that it is Russia that should influence the future the most. But to be effective, first, this post-Soviet space needs to be reintegrated. That's what they're hearing. Unfortunately, that's what it is. Coming back to the Institute of National Remembrance, politics of memory. This is a complex question. This historical policy, if you will, is something which is approaching the past somewhat unevenly, because yes, the past should be recalled, should be remembered in various monographies, and there is this issue of the so-called cursed soldiers. It is what we call Polska Lubelska, the Poland of Lublin. So this is the subject which has not so much maybe dominated, but it was overrepresented. I didn't like it all that much, and I was open about it. And yet, when you look at these books, you can see that they are very well made, but they are directed at certain things that should not be so over-exaggerated. Also, it matters because of social cohesion here in Poland. I'm not sure if this is a good answer to this question. When the Institute for National Remembrance was being set up, I saw it. It was in Warsaw, where the prosecutor's office is located now, and we were not sure whether this organ, this body, should be set up or not, and we concluded that yes, it is very much needed. But we had doubts about accumulating collections, because that would basically imply dividing collections. So the Institute for National Remembrance has its own archives, and they are huge. Now, the Institute for National Remembrance plays an important role because they are the protector of those archives, and this role is not to be overestimated. Thank you very much, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, soon we'll have to finish this discussion for a number of reasons, including the fact that the professor is sick today and still decided to share his knowledge with you. There is one more question, though, Professor. Please go ahead. Is it okay? Yes. Professor Łukaszewski. Just a short observation and a question.
Stacjonowanie rosyjskich wojsk Ja,
the
czytałem to
Russian
kilka razy w
forces
innych
and where and how they
publikacjach.
stationed.
Jest,
I've
wydaje
read
mi
it
się,
in a
poważnie
number of
brane
books and
przyjąco.
papers,
Musimy sobie
and I believe
przypomnieć,
that
że
the
nie tylko
Russians are actually
rosyjskie
considering
wojska
very
stacjonowały
seriously.
we
Remember
wschodnich Niemczech,
that Russian
ale
forces
też
stationed in East
między rokiem
Germany, but also
1815 i 1825,
between
także
1815 and
w Paryżu.
1820s, the Russian
A
forces
także
also stationed in
Europa
Paris.
Zachodnia nie powinna się czuć
So the
zbyt
Western Europe,
bezpiecznie, biorąc
Western
tą,
Europe should not
tą
feel too
uwagę
safe
pod
considering
uwagę.
these
Druga
facts.
sprawa to jest, co
Secondly,
powiedział dr Hittinger, a
Dr. Kissinger
podział
has mentioned the
wschodu i
following.
zachodu teraz się komplikuje, dlatego
That is
że
the East and the West, and this
podczas gdy
division is becoming more complicated.
religia
What I mean?
prawosławna, a potem komunistyczna.
First, from the
Teraz
East,
jak
you had this
Hittinger
encroachment
zauważył,
of the Orthodox Church and
idzie
then of
z
communism.
zachodu
And now,
ateizm
from the
i
rest, there is this
taki
encroachment on the part of
ekstremalny liberalizm.
atheism.
W środku jest
And Polska is in the,
And
Poland
in the
is in the middle.
center, there is Poland, which is severed, which is bisected, as we know very well. And here the role of IPN or IPN and the role of the Catholic Church is,
moim zdaniem,
I
trudna,
believe,
ale
very difficult,
niezmiernie ważna
but it's extremely important. And
zasługuje na nasze 100% wsparcie.
really
Dziękuję bardzo profesorowi
deserves
Wojciechowi za
100%
bardzo
support.
ciekawe
I'd like to thank you, Professor, for a very interesting presentation, and may I
Dziękuję
also
bardzo
thank all the participants who have
bardzo na
asked
zdrowie.
very good
Dziękuję
questions.
bardzo
Thank you
i
very
za ten
much.
głos, i za te życzenia.
I'd like to
Bardzo
thank
się
for the wishes and
Tak,
also
podniósł pan
for everything
problem
you've said.
stacjonowania rosyjskich
Now, the
wojsk.
problem
Oczywiście
of
jest
Russian
od początku
army being
XX
stationed
wieku.
here
Przecież
has been
Suworow
here
doszedł do
since
Szwajcarii.
the start.
I tam
Suvorov reached
funkcjonuje Muzeum
Switzerland.
Suworowa.
There's even the
Szwajcarzy przez krótki
museum of
okres nie
Suvorov because
poznali
the
się
Swiss, in a
na
short
tych gościach, bo
period, they
uważają,
didn't really
oni
realize
uratowali
who
przed
those people are, and they
wplątaniem w
believe
wojnę.
that they
Natomiast
saved them from being entangled into the war. Now, with the Soviet army being withdrawn from Central Europe, the problem of Russian troops being stationed here hasn't ended. That's Syria. They are leaving Syria now, but they will definitely keep the marine and air base. That's the Transnistria, the Republic of the 14th Army. General Lebied once surrounded it with the army and claimed independence. That's Abkhazia, Southern Ossetia, with huge Russian garrisons hanging over Georgia. Ivanishvili is said to run pro-Russian policy, but he takes into account the things the question of foreign armies being stationed there is a problem that continues and it hasn't finished yet. I subscribe to your anxiety that we buy from the West not what is worth it, but what is definitely not worth it. Instead of buying technical progress and know-how, industrial cooperation, we buy some libertine ideas. We move away following the fashionable things fashionable in Holland and Belgium where the churches are empty. Well, the situation of church is difficult in Poland. A lot is now being said about certain shadows of the Polish church. It's openly discussed, but this has to be overcome, and one needs to work towards holding that religious foundation of Polishness understood in the categories of patriotism, that it retained its religious component. That's very important. it doesn't look very well. A lot will depend on how this situation in Ukraine will develop. If there is something that we believe Trump will do, Eastern Ukraine will become part of Russia and Western will be a state, the Ukrainian state, and Central will be that demilitarized zone, nobody's land really. That is a situation that may for many years result in this being just a barrel of powder and it will be enough to strike a match and have it explode. Things like those don't work. We can say that the division of Cyprus somehow works despite the decades gone, but when you're there and when you watch it, neither the Turkish nor the Greek parts are happy or satisfied. No. It's hard for Poles is the situation in Ukraine, and we're most afraid of that. And this turn away from Catholicism is superimposed on that, and that all is no reason for optimism whatsoever. Thank you very much, Professor, for all your answers and for your lecture. Very interesting, very rich. We'd like to thank Dr. Corrigan as well for highly interesting introduction and also for launching this cooperation. Thanks to your openness to cooperation, we've had an opportunity to organize this event and we'll be able to publish it on our YouTube channel, in which way those who couldn't be with us here today will be able to refresh this meeting and get inspired with many interesting bits of information that we've received here. We'd like to thank our Houston friends for cooperation again and now. Ladies and gentlemen, please let us also thank the sponsor of this event. It's co-financed from the Polish government by the Minister of Education and Science as part of social responsibility of science program. Now finishing, can I ask whether our Houston people would like to take the floor? Dr. John Corrigan, how about you? Would you like to say something?
Yes, I just want to thank you, Lukasz, for organizing this wonderful event and the opportunity to meet Dr. Matersky and the other guests who came to ask wonderful questions. Thank you so much, and we look forward to future collaborations. Wonderful, wonderful day.
Tak, my również się cieszymy, a jeśli chodzi o oczekiwania, to oprócz
We
oczekiwań na
are
kolejne spotkanie,
also
zachęcam
very
Państwa
grateful,
do
and
wysłuchania,
may I now
w zasadzie,
suggest that you look out for the book, for Professor's book,
ukazywać już niedługo
which
w
will
angielskiej
soon
wersji
be
nakładu wydawnictwa
published
De Gruyter,
in
niemieckiej
English
wersji
by De
nakładu
Gruyter
wydawnictwa
and in
Peterla. Na naszej
German
stronie
by
naszej
Peter
fundacji
Line.
fundacjakurtyki.pl będziemy oczywiście o tym
fundacja.kurtyki.pl,
informować.
you will have an
Jeszcze raz
opportunity
dziękuję
to
panu
learn
profesorowi
about it.
za
I'd like to thank you,
bardzo
Professor, very
prezentację.
much for this
I do zobaczenia.
interesting lecture, and I thank all of you for presence, and well, let's meet again.